it takes more energy to start the thing than to do the thing. And so if you think about it for a minute, it takes more energy to start the thing than to actually do the thing. And so a lot of us get caught up in just thinking about starting. And that's the biggest challenge a lot of us experience, is just starting the thing. And so we were just talking about how both of us in our athletic backgrounds, 2 different sports, how we had different modalities that helped us just start and what came from that. So that's really what sparked today's intention to run this audio event. And so that said, Josh, do you want to share anything before we get into it?
No, the only thing I'd say is, like we talked about ahead of time, like we're just going to keep it conversational. Josh and I have been in many conversations where we are like, we wish we were recording right now, because we're just kind of talking about our backgrounds and experiences. And that, to me, what was really interesting is we do come from different worlds, and as we've noted, completely different sports, completely different backgrounds, experiences, and yet we found a lot of common threads that we share together in terms of mindset and how we approach life in general. So we're just kind of going to riff on that, and like Josh said, we'll open it up at the end for dialogue and conversation. But also, like, if we say something or get on a topic that's like, hey, I'd love to contribute to that, don't hesitate to raise your hand, and we can let people in to be a part of the conversation. So with that, Josh, you ready to get started?
Yeah, for sure. And that actually, everything you just shared reminds me of something that I continue to be reminded of myself and to share with other people, is on the macro level, we all experience similar human experiences. It just may look different in the micro of our lives. So we may see things differently. We may have different environments that we're growing up in, or that we're working in, or that we're living in. But we all share similar experiences internally as a human being. And that's the mind and the body, and then how the thoughts and the emotions all, interact with us, that they're similar to the other person. So when we get to having conversations, the autobiography of our lives, so to speak, may look differently. But then as we get to connecting and sharing stories and sharing experiences, then we realize, like, oh man, like I struggle with that too, or I've been challenged with that as well, or I experienced this, in my own way. And so we create really, at the end of the day, we create strong connection, and then that connection allows us to feel supported, support one another, and at the end of the day, move forward in the best way possible. And that's our intention with this audio event. And so the first bullet, if you will, that we had on the agenda today was talking about transferring fear or nerves by self-talk and these different mantras, if you will. And so I'll share from my background in BMX, one of the challenges with just starting, taking all that energy to just break through and do that thing, was maybe dropping into a ramp for the first time. And this is in any action sports, whether it's skateboarding or it's, bikes of any kind. And it's just like you have all these thoughts that go through your head about, dropping into this, whether it's a 4-foot ramp, a 6-foot ramp, a 12-foot ramp. And you're just like, you're thinking about all these things that could go wrong. And I think that's the human condition, is to think about all the things that could go wrong in life, not all the things that could go well, the things that we are, chasing, the things that we want to go well. And so get caught up in these thought loops that turn into stories. And then those create emotional experiences that influence our behavior. And so in BMX, we had these things like just drop in, or, just send it. And we would just hype each other up to just either, when we're younger, first starting out, just dropping in the ramp. And as we progress, and it's just like, I'm afraid of doing this trick, just send it. And like, we just help each other, just fire each other up. And then if we, get to that point where we actually push through, whether we fall or not, it's like, oh, that the dam's broken, so to speak, that saying, how it goes. And it's just like, after that, every attempt is easier and easier until you reach success. And I know, Josh, with you have a different background in sports, and that was in baseball. So why don't you share the mantra that you had?
Yeah, so I was a relief and closing pitcher, and all that meant was simply after the starting pitcher got tired, let's say after 5-6 innings, I would come in often the highest pressure situations. And, I spent most of my time in the bullpen, which is where the pitchers hang out, kind of waiting for, our name number to be called to start warming up. And, one of the funny things that I was thinking about ahead of this that I would do in the bullpen where we would warm up is when they would tell me to start warming up, I would not stop. I would keep throwing and throwing. And all the guys would look at me and be like, what are you doing? You are going to get tired. You're going to wear your arm out. But the reason I did that is because when I was throwing, I wasn't thinking. The nerves and the fear went away. So from the start that they said, hey, start warming up, like I just kept going. And then eventually, like it could be an inning, it could be 2 innings, it could be 3 innings before I actually ever go in the game. And so I would kind of warm up, cool down, like depending on the dynamics of like if it was clear that I wasn't going into the game, I would stop. But once I was ready to go in, I'd go out to the mound and immediately start throwing warm-up pitches. So my thing was don't think, just throw. Like get out there, start throwing the ball, and get into the zone, because even in the warm-up pitches, like you're still going and you're starting to get into that more narrow focus where the only thing I'm thinking about and looking at is the catcher. But then the thing that happens is then you got to wait for the umpires to get ready. You got to wait for the first batter to come up, and that like creates that moment of silence again where it's like, okay, here I am with my thoughts. And that's where that mantra around don't think, just throw that first pitch, take that first action was something that I used repetitively to get myself back in and in the game, to find that zone again, where again the only thing that was in my periphery was the catcher and the batter. And so that's something that's persisted with me for the rest of for getting into my career, and everything I've experienced since is like, once you take that first step, once you do that first thing, it's much easier to keep going. It takes less energy to sustain, and to the fear and the nerves and all that kind of dissipates and goes away. So that was something that I used in my experience to kind of traverse that initial fear that I would feel that never went away. It was always there.
Yeah, and you spoke to a challenge that is the time that goes between, or that comes between when you're ready and then when you have to wait for the other, piece of competition. In this case, it was waiting for the umpire, waiting for the batter to get up, and so you got thrown out of your routine. But you created a new routine to keep you in check, and that was just the phrase, the mantra you had written under your hat. That was just throw the first pitch. So you kept focusing on it, and then I know in BMX, when we competed, we compete in groups of 4, and each one of us would get a 60-second run, and then there'd be time between each other's runs for the camera stuff or getting the course cleared or whatever it was. So you may be waiting at least 4 to 8 minutes before you take your second run. So it's groups of 4, 60-second runs. You get 2 runs each. And so there was a lot of time that'd go by. So you would start to, see other riders, maybe crash or do a run that you would have to compete with your own thoughts of like, oh man, how am I going to beat their run? Or how am I going to beat my last run? Or all these different stories start coming in. And so what really helped me was just to continue being obsessed with focusing on my intention for the next run or that first run, just visualizing everything I've been doing in practice the days leading up to the event on every ramp, every trick I'd be doing. So that way I could continue to stay in my own flow in my head. And then when it was time to drop in from my run, when I heard my name get called, everything just shut out and I'd lock in and I'd get into that flow state. And so I'm curious with what you were mentioning of like, you'd be, warming up, nonstop pitching. As soon as you get to, or throwing the ball, as soon as you get to the mound, you just, do your warm up pitches, but then you had to wait. There was that gap. Was it similar for you? And if so, what did you do to help you in between?
So I would pace around the mound. Like I would keep moving. That was my big thing, was like keep my body moving. So I would walk off the back of the mound. I'd walk in half circles back and forth, just to keep from just standing there and waiting. Like anything to prevent movement from stopping. So as long as I was moving and in the zone of thinking about like, okay, here's the batter that's up. I already knew kind of their track record for the previous at-bats in the game. I knew what I was going to throw. I knew, everything that was going to proceed or follow, them getting up to the plate. And then, in reality, you're talking about 20 to 30 seconds, which can feel like an eternity, but I just kept myself moving in that moment to ensure that, when I actually got up to the plate, it was like, boom, back in the zone, time to throw the first pitch.
Yeah, so when it comes through working through challenges of any kind, like adversity, and especially in both of our cases as athletes, repetitive failure, what is it that helped you move forward?
Yeah, I mean, that was that's a big thing about baseball. It is a game of failure, right? When you think about a good batting average is, hitting the ball, getting on base 30% of the time, right? So it is a literal game of failure. And the big thing from a team perspective, right, when we think about community, tribe, team first attitude, was always picking each other up. And the constant reminder that we always gave each other was like, that one's over, get the next one. Like every single time somebody struck out, somebody had a bad inning pitching, somebody, whatever the case may be, right? They make a mistake, they fail to do what they were setting out to do. When they're walking back to the dugout, the first thing everybody says is pick them up, right? Go let them know like, hey, that one's over. The most important thing you can do is get the next one. And that's always hard to work through. But nonetheless, like having those individuals around you, that team to build you back up when you make that mistake or have that moment of failure, like that was critical for us. And we all did it collectively together and just was an inherent part of how we operated as a team. The other thing I think about with like challenges and adversity is the circumstances are never going to be perfect, right? You always get a different set of circumstances that are often unideal. So coming into a game, especially in the middle where, I was coming in when we were up a run or two and the game was mine to lose. One of the best games I ever threw that comes to mind was also one of the coldest games I ever played in. I can't remember what the temperature was, but I remember being in the bullpen and our coaches had the idea of, all right, it's cold. You got to keep your arm warm while we're waiting. Go out and sit in the team van and put your arm on a vent. So I literally put my jacket on. We started the van and I put my sleeve up against the vent and I kept my arm warm. And as I'm sitting there, I'm thinking like, I talked about my habits and my routines. Like I would keep throwing in the bullpen. I wasn't doing that. So I start to have that moment of like quiet and stillness. And I'm in my head. I'm like, I'm not in routine. I'm not this. I'm not that. And all of a sudden I had this thing pop into my head where I'm like, you know what? This is hilarious. I'm sitting here. I could go into the game at any moment and I'm sitting in the van outside the field, keeping my arm warm. And in that moment, when I kind of put some humor to it, I'm like, you know what, who cares? Like, this is funny. This is a great moment. This is a good story. I'm just going to go out there and throw. And that's what I did. I came into the game, bottom of the seventh inning. We were up 2 runs, bases loaded, 0 outs. So it was like the highest pressure situation I had ever thrown in. But I came in with a mindset of like, go in, don't think, just throw, your arm's warm, it's all good. And in that moment, like all the circumstances disappear. It doesn't matter because again, you just start doing the thing. And once I started throwing, all the circumstances, it didn't matter because I had one job and my job was to throw the ball to the catcher and get the batters out. And that's what I did. So, that's been a story I've always reminded myself of when I come up against adversity, challenges, et cetera, is like, you know what? Like those things disappear when we start to take action and we do what we know how to do.
Yeah, what comes to mind is building a stack of receipts or proof that we're able to do the thing that we are set out to do now that we've done in the past. And that's why preparation and practice is so important, because the more prepared we are, especially for circumstances out of our control mentally, the more confidence we build. And that reminds me of like the quote that goes something along the lines of like competence breeds confidence. You can't have one without the other. So if you plug into that framework, those habits, the practice, the skills, day in, day out, you build a level of competency that builds the proof of the type of person that you are and gives you the confidence that you are equipped to do the job at hand. And that also leads to the idea of adaptability. And you just spoke to an experience where you had to adapt to a new environment. The circumstances were different. The weather wasn't perfect. And it reminds me of my last year competing in 2016. We were in Edmonton, Canada, and it was an outdoor event. And the day of finals was super windy and the sun was setting. And so when it came to my group and where I was starting on the course, where I was dropping in to set up for my first trick, I was partially blinded by the sun. So I had to be as confident in my preparation as I could, because I was starting out with, it's called an alley-oop 720. So you travel from left to right, but you spin to left. Well, so I spin to left. So when you go and you spin away from the direction you're moving in the air, it's called an alley-oop. And I was doing 2 full rotations, transferring from one ramp into the landing of a different ramp. And I've been doing it in practice. And so when it came to my run, I was like, and I can't see the landing. I can't see where I'm going because the sun's there. I had to just rely on my preparation, and each one of my 2 runs in finals, I stomped it and then did the rest of my run. So I was proud of it. But it speaks to a similar experience that you just shared of having to adapt to our environment because the circumstances aren't going to be the same. And I think that that's probably the biggest thing that I've learned from my background in sports is having the mindset to do the work day in, day out when no one's watching, especially so you can show up and perform when all eyes are on you, especially when the environment isn't ideal.
Yeah, and you're always going to feel the fear and the nerves in those moments. And it took me a long time to realize that, like just even getting into leadership and running a company and public speaking, all these things, like we always have that feeling at the start. And that's where action is so important, because I've heard even people talking about, skydiving, jumping out of a plane. Like you're terrified until you jump out of the plane, because then in that moment, there's nothing for your body to try to protect, your mind to try to protect you from, because you're already doing the thing. And so I'm curious, like, you're looking at 12 6-foot ramps, like whatever you're dropping in from, you're upside down on a bike, you're doing these insane, skillful moves and tricks. Like when you're about to drop in, what did that feel like? What were you thinking? What did you see? Like walk us through kind of the senses going into that moment and what happened as soon as you did actually drop in.
So it's interesting because when you start something, you're in a different mental space, a different emotional space, and then therefore a different physical space. Like you do things differently. When it got to my last year competing, for example, when I was about to drop in, all I was doing was visualizing my run. I was visualizing every trick on every ramp I was going to touch in that 60 seconds. And I was just I was standing over my bike, holding my handlebars, just waiting for my name to get called. As soon as my name got called, my mind went blank and I put my feet on the pedals and then I just dropped into the ramp and then did my run. And the interesting thing that it's so wild to think about is the evolution of skill. Because when I first started, it was just all focused on doing everything the best I could to initiate the drop in. But then because I started there, that's how we progress. We start with the basics, we master the fundamentals. Dropping in just became something I did. It was just a part of who I was that did the thing. It wasn't even on my mind. I didn't consciously think of it. And it goes back to why habits are such a thing. They are there to preserve energy. So when we're starting a new skill, we're so focused on that first step. And then we start to think about the second step. And so to your question, at that point, my last year competing, there was nothing going through my head other than what I was going to do on the ramps in the time to come. But before, it was this obsession with just rolling my tires into the ramp.
And so let's talk through like mistakes or failures. So when you would make a mistake, what would your self-talk look like? Especially earlier in your career, and then how that transitioned as you matured later in your BMX career.
It's interesting because in BMX, and I'm trying to think back to when I first started riding and I'd fall or I couldn't do a trick. I kept trying and trying. There was only frustration, but a obsessive amount of persistence. Like no matter, it was only when I couldn't literally get back up and try again that I would move on and go home. But like the self-talk, it was never a negative self-talk. There was never like and it's weird to think this because it was only in this domain of my life. There was never a like, I'm not good enough to do this trick or I can't do that. It was just it was just a level of frustration to where I remember like there'd be times where I'd been trying this trick for hours on a day where I would just get so frustrated. I would just start tearing up out of just pure frustration and just thinking and asking myself like, what do I need to do to land this trick? But then at the time when I was, as a teenager, outside of my life, there was all the negative self-talk. Like, I'm not good enough, I'm stupid, especially when it came to school and like reading and writing and even speaking to people. But as I got older and as I progressed, that's when the self-talk really started to become a hindrance, where it was like, I would try a trick and it didn't work, especially if it didn't work first try, because I got to a level where tricks just happened relatively quickly. I would just learn and progress really quick. And then I get to a point where I would say like, oh man, like maybe this trick just doesn't work for me. Maybe like I'm not good enough at this style of riding like that person. Maybe I can't do this. And I have to catch myself. So that's where like the conscious awareness of my self-talk really started to kick in terms of like my ability and what I wanted to do. So my last year competing, I was coming off of a torn ACL. Well, I'd been riding and competing on a torn ACL for 2 years prior, but I was coming out of the reconstructive surgery. And all of the prehab and the rehab was dedicated, of course, to my recovery physically, but more importantly, I was focused on the mental game, because I realized a lot of athletes that didn't get back to their sport at the level they could, it was all mental. And so I really just started to harness my focus and become aware of the thoughts that were going through my head and my self-talk, and just dedicate everything I could to the objective. My objective that year was to make the finals at every stop of the World Series and just land every trick in my run the best I could. And so when it came to falling and failure in practice at home training, my routine was if I fell, I would get up and I'd have to do that trick 3 to 5 times in a row before I could let it go. And if I fell on a new trick that I, been on and off, but I didn't get to the point where it was like, all right, my routine now is to do it 3 times in a row every session, especially if I fell 3 to 5 times. But if it wasn't quite there yet, because it was a new trick, I was just stoked to land it once that day. If I fell, I couldn't leave the trick alone until I landed it once.
Yeah. I think this self-talk and the mindset influences outcomes, right? Like, it's why in baseball, the second I started to think and get in my head was when I started to throw terribly. And like for me, I got to go deep here because I don't know any other way to make this make sense. But I didn't get there. I didn't get to a point in, at the end of my college career where I had really figured out that, hey, I don't have to beat myself up to create drive and ambition. And, a lot of that for me came from my childhood. So my dad's a Vietnam vet. He's somebody with over 50 years of untreated PTSD. And, that created a lot of experiences in my childhood with the things that he did to numb his pain that he was experiencing. And it took me a very long time beyond my college career, like getting into my mid-20s to figure all of this out. But what it did was it created this weird dichotomy in my childhood where there was some really hard nights, and then there was the pain, and then there was the beauty. There was, all the things that they invested in me to give me the experiences of, playing baseball from the age of like 8 all the way through college. And but what it did was where I got affirmations was where I showed up and was doing, right? Where I got good grades, when I did well in athletics, et cetera. And that's what created my drive, ambition, and initiative, but from a place of scarcity. Because if I wasn't doing those things, I wasn't worthy. I wasn't good enough. And that manifested into a way that motivated me to do well. But in the long run, like I learned in my mid-20s, like getting into leadership and becoming a husband and a father, like that was never going to be sustainable. So yeah, I would get up on the mound, and if I threw well, it would feel euphoric. I would feel amazing. I would walk away from that game feeling great. If I didn't throw well, I would beat myself up. There was nobody that could punish me worse than I could punish myself. And that's something I really had to get past. Like, it did drive me to do better on the next one, but not from a place of abundance, not from a place of like, I want to learn, improve, and grow. Like, I still had these things I was carrying on to. And that's where we talked in the past, where it's like, that's one thing from a mindset perspective. I wish I would have known sooner, that I would have uncovered some of these things at an earlier age, and the difference that would have made in the outcomes of like being an even better pitcher, being an even better teammate. Because I let anger and frustration and all these things get in the way of my full potential. And again, that's something that I learned in the work that I had to do getting into my mid-20s to let go of some of those things, which I'm grateful it happened when it did, because it's completely impacted my mindset and how I show up as a husband, father, and leader.
Yeah, I think that's another thing that we share in common, especially on the timeline of how old we were, because it was into my mid 20s where that same thing became very evident for me. And it was when I was 21 and a concussion led to an MRI that accidentally found a brain tumor. I got to go through brain surgery to remove it. Thankfully, there was that option. And I started to realize like a lot of my success early on in my career was driven by the emotion of fear, anger, and like wanting to prove people wrong that doubted me. So like this spiteful attitude. And what I took on as the meaning of going through what I went through at such an early age was that fuel was so motivating to get me started, but it wasn't sustainable. I had to be determined to do something fueled by a more positive, sustainable energy source. And that's when I started to really understand taking care of myself and even start thinking about what I was thinking about. I never thought of thoughts in that regard. Never questioned what I was thinking. I always just thought that's what was going through my head. And it was just, I'm thinking about whatever I'm observing, or my thoughts are who I am. And it wasn't until those experiences that I did the inner work, or I started doing the inner work, and it's continued, of course, it always will, to where I realized like, oh man, like I gotta show up in a more sustainable manner, and anger and spite and fear are not sustainable. They're great to get you started, but as you mentioned too, like it's such a different level of energy when we're showing up for a deeper purpose than, fear from something, trying to run from something, or trying to prove people wrong in my case, or whatever it may be. And when we can be fueled by something that's of service to other people, our purpose is larger than ourselves. I mean, that's where I find a lot of fulfillment and solace, I guess is a good word to put into it, of what I experience today. And it's being drawn towards something that does not yet exist in terms of improving a situation. And I admire you being a father, because that's something that my wife and I have been discussing recently. That's the idea that we want to have a child, we want to have a family. And I know that running off of negative emotions is not the way to lead a team, lead ourselves, and most importantly, leading a family. So I appreciate you sharing that.
Well, and those were the big things that allowed me to start to shift, right? Becoming a husband, becoming a father. I carried a lot of this pain from my past that I had no idea that I was carrying, but then I saw it start to manifest in my son. And, that was the eye-opening moment where I was like, okay, I've got to start looking deeper within myself to understand that, like, I've got to take control of who I am and quit telling myself this story that, like, just because who my dad is, that's going to impact how I show up for my wife, how I show up for my kids. And yeah, I always say my kids are my best teachers, because leading a team is one thing, but where I always struggled was like, okay, why can I go over here and lead a team effectively and get all these accolades for showing up for people, but then I really struggled to come home and show up for my wife and my kids. Well, at that time before I had two others. And that was just the eye-opening moment where, like, okay, like, look inward to produce outward. I had to learn that over the course of a couple of years, that, like, all of this is inside work, right? Mindset comes from an internal focus of really shifting from the place of to me to the place of by me, or as you say, at cause instead of at effect, and really taking control of realizing, like, we can take a look at our values and principles and really align our thoughts, actions, behaviors, maybe not so much thoughts, but actions and behaviors and decisions in that, and look at thoughts as a thing it just is. Thoughts are just something that flow, and we can either choose to attach to them or not to attach to them. But it's a lot of the skills I had to build to get to a place where I have true mental resilience when I come up against obstacles and adversity, because 21-year-old me, he had so much to learn with regard to, like, hey, when you hit that failure or that mistake, like, there's a much more healthy way to get better and learn and improve and grow for the next time, rather than beating myself up. And, the funny thing is, like, this is such a repeated saying, but, like, would you talk that way to your friend? Like, of course not. I would always be there and be supportive for my teammates. But for myself, if I made a mistake, that was unacceptable. And so I had a lot to learn about self-compassion.
Yeah. And you said a lot of things. And I think two things I want to conclude this section with is, leading ourselves is the best way to be a leader for other people, because if we're not aware of how we're showing up and what's running the show, so to speak, in our mind, and then how that's influencing how we speak and act, then we're not going to be an effective leader. And as you pointed out, it took seeing some of the things transpire in your son for you to be like, oh, like this is mirroring to me who I am and how I show up. Maybe I need to make some changes. And I think that that's a sign of a great leader. I know we both share, especially some of the people listening, we both share an appreciation for Jocko Willink and his, extreme ownership mentality. And I know you referenced the to me or by me, which I learned about that reading the 15 Commitments of Conscious Leadership, and then how I interpret it is living at cause rather than at effect to my reality. Either which way you look at it, it's a sense of taking ownership of ourselves and empowering ourselves to realize that we're making our reality, like we're participating in creating our reality. So anything that we're experiencing is a mirroring to us of what we're committed to doing in our lives or not. And it's just showing us, our results are showing us what our commitments are. And a lot of people don't like that because they don't like to think like, oh, I'm like committed to my health. And I made a video about this recently. It was like, well, if you use the excuse you don't have time to exercise, but you say you're committed to your health, there's nothing wrong with that. But you clearly don't prioritize your health because your commitments show otherwise. And so I think what you were sharing, it really speaks to taking ownership of our mindset and how we show up in our lives. And I'm curious, I want to share briefly what I see mindset as, and I'm curious of what your take is on it. Because my understanding of mindset is it's a combination of our perspective, our perceptions, and our thoughts and our beliefs, these different paradigms we have. And I'm just curious, like, how do you see mindset?
To me, it all comes back to self-awareness. In understanding, asking that big question, who am I? Who do I want to be? And self-awareness is the thing. It took me a long time to realize like the power of like, there's two sides to self-awareness, right? There's how we view ourselves, and then there's how others view us. And that has really, like, mindset for me all goes back to values and principles. Like, what are the things that I stand for? And what are the principles that guide how I'm going to show up every single day? And some of those are just, that we share in common around like, how do we approach challenges and obstacles, and looking at them as an opportunity, and not to be, overtly optimistic, but more of a pragmatic optimism, even in a moment that's like really hard for a team to say, hey, it's okay. Like, we can work through this together. Not to say, hey, look at the sunshine and the rainbows. It's not always about that, but it's about seeing the not just the opportunities, but knowing and trusting that we can get through those things, especially together and collectively, and having that community and tribe. So it all goes back to self-awareness for me. That's what changed my life, was when I really started asking these deep internal questions of who am I? Who do I want to be? And realizing that I actually had the power to make those changes, to let go of the things that I thought defined me, that were just stories and narratives that I had created based on the conditioning of my experiences in childhood. And once I let those go, I was able to redefine who I thought I wanted to be, how I thought I wanted to show up, and then reinforce that by talking to the individuals that I really trusted. Like, some of the most important things to me are to show up in every room as the same person. And I didn't create that on my own. I got that feedback from somebody on my team that said, hey, I really appreciate that you're always yourself. I'm like, oh, okay. I guess that's authenticity. That is important to me. And so, that other side of the coin where people can offer us that feedback, that's what has really reinforced my mindset around values, principles, and who I want to be, how I want to show up, how I want to, treat my wife and show up for her, how I want to be there for my kids, what that looks like as far as work-life harmony, and making sure they remember that I was there. And of course, like as a leader, and how I want to guide my team and create an environment where people do feel seen, heard, and supported, and knowing that, we're never going to prioritize hitting a deadline over somebody having a personal experience going on that takes priority. So yeah, it always comes back to self-awareness for me.
So it sounds like it, but I'm just curious if you'd agree that like mindset is a choice. And I think a lot of people, from my perspective, that wouldn't agree with that is because they don't realize how much of our mind is unconscious, how much of the thoughts that we have every day are unconscious. Therefore, the things that we do are largely unconscious. I think that's the whole point of habit. So I'm curious, would you agree with that perspective?
Today, I agree with it. 5 years ago, I wouldn't have agreed with it because I was still stuck in a place where I blamed everything from my past. I blamed my dad for who I was. And when I realized, like, no, I can actually take control of that and choose how I want to show up, what I want to, how the mindset I'm going to have for different scenarios. So today, and after doing a lot of that internal work to let go of those things, like 100%, I think mindset is a choice. I think, especially when it comes to values and principles, the big thing for me is it's not one size fits all. Your experience of having a health crisis and having to work through that influenced who you are today. Me working through some of the childhood things with having a dad with PTSD, that conditioned and created who I am today. And I've chosen to look at that in a way that, like, although I had a lot of those hard experiences, at the end of the day, they made me who I am. And it doesn't make them not hard, but it has influenced different aspects of the characteristics of that make me. And so, that's something I always want to be encouraging of people is like, yes, it's a choice, but just know, like, when we're talking about values and principles, like, you have to tailor that to you, right? Because, like, especially people that have been conditioned, whether it's childhood or as being adult, as having experienced, traumatic things, having gone to combat or war or whatever the case may be in what they've experienced in their personal lives, is it's a choice. First, to open up and say, hey, I want to take a look at this. I want to be willing to change, and I want help to do that, because I don't think we can do it by ourselves. But then, giving yourself the grace to know, like, hey, you gotta adapt in whatever way works for you and your experiences, because everybody is different.